Lesson 13, National and State Powers, Chapter 4, Section 1. The division of powers. Now, powers are divided between governments. The governments are the state governments and the federal governments. These governments have different types of powers. So the federal government has exclusive powers. These are powers only the federal government can use. Reserve powers are called that because of the 10th Amendment, which reserves powers to the states or to the people. Now, reserve powers, in terms of discussing federalism, are powers only the state has. The federal government does not have reserve powers. It has exclusive powers. However, there are powers that both the federal and state governments share. These kinds of powers are called concurrent powers. Now, some powers are denied to the federal government, and there are powers that are denied to the state government as well. Some of them are denied to both of them. And this basic design of federalism remains today. However, the state and federal relationship is always changing. So we're going to get into that. I'm going to give you a little time here to kind of look at this and maybe jot down some notes. But again, you have power divided between the governments. You have exclusive powers only the federal government can use. You have reserve powers. Those are powers that are reserved to the states or to the people. And then you have powers that are shared by the federal and state governments called concurrent powers. And we need to understand there are limits on the powers of both the federal government and the state government. There are powers neither of them can have. There are powers that the federal government can't have, and there are powers that the state governments can't have. And this system of government has been in place since the Constitution was ratified, and the relationship between state power and federal power and how they work together changes over time due to conditions. Now, the national powers. There are three types of powers that the federal government has. These are collectively known as delegated powers. Although I've seen books that don't even bring up one of these categories, but we'll talk about that here in a second. Express powers, or enumerated powers, are the powers that are written down in the Constitution. A lot of them are in Article 1, Section 8, number 1, number 2, number 3, so enumerated, numbered, or expressed as in written down. Implied powers are not written down, but they are suggested by the express powers. These are necessary and proper powers in order to carry out express powers, so the necessary and proper clause is a key to understanding implied powers. So, for example, the commerce power, which allows Congress to pass laws that regulate commerce or trade, this means that there's the implied power to set up a national bank. Inherent powers are the last of the three, and these inherent powers are powers any government has, defining its borders and defining who is and who isn't a citizen. Now, the thing about inherent powers is some books don't even really bring that up and discuss it too much. The states and the nation. Now, some were afraid that the federal government was far too powerful under this new plan under the Constitution. James Madison disagreed. He argued that there were set limits on the federal government, that the state governments would be plenty strong. He even argued that one of the things that would keep the people free in the system was the idea that, he argued in one of the Federalist Papers, was that what would happen is, if we didn't have a federal system like we have, is that perhaps states, because they have local elites that are homogenous, as Madison would put it, in other words, the elites there have the same interests, they would lord it over the regular people in their state a lot more easily if there wasn't this stronger federal government, national government, that would keep them in check, and that they would have to deal with elites with different interests and compromise at the federal level. Remember, the 10th Amendment reserves some powers to the states. This is part of James Madison's argument. The example of reserved powers that we can place here on this slide is running public schools. The Supremacy Clause is very key to understanding the relationship of federal government and state government. The Supremacy Clause is in Article 6, Section 2, and it has been found that there are three elements to the supreme law of the land. There are the laws within the Constitution itself, treaties passed by Congress, negotiated with the President, and they have the force of law, and then congressional acts. Basically, the laws, federal laws. And another element of the Supremacy Clause, well, actually of Article 6, is that the national and state officials have to swear to uphold the Constitution. Now we get to concurrent powers, or shared powers between both national and state governments. Examples of concurrent or shared powers are the powers to tax. You know, we have a state income tax, we have a federal income tax. The power to set up courts, the power to define what are crimes. So there are federal crimes and there are state crimes. And the power of eminent domain. The federal government can come in and take private property for federal purposes. They do have to pay just compensation. That's in the Bill of Rights, so they have to pay you a fair price for land they take from you. But the state governments can do the same thing. Now, denied powers, powers denied the government. Some of these are listed in Article 1, Section 9. They include things like you can't pass bills of attainder. You can't pass ex post facto laws. There are strict definitions for what treason is. You cannot tax exports. That's another restriction in the Constitution. The federal government cannot interfere with reserve powers. That's one of the denied powers. States cannot do the following. They can't make treaties. They cannot make their own money. They cannot issue titles of nobility. They cannot make laws that impair contracts, you know, like between states, other people from other states, and so on. And they can only make an interstate compact, which is an agreement between one state and other states, or a state and foreign government, without the permission of Congress. So they have to have permission from Congress in order to make interstate compacts. And then there are denied powers, basically limits on the power of state and federal governments that are listed in the Bill of Rights, although the Bill of Rights originally, as we've already learned, was more focused in on limiting federal power instead of state power. The federal government also has an obligation to the states. There are three things the federal government has to guarantee to the states. The first thing is that the states are guaranteed to have a Republican form of government, and it's the federal government's responsibility to make sure that happens. So Congress basically requires states to follow democratic processes. An example is, after the Civil War, legislation that was passed, and frankly amendments that were made to the Constitution, to make sure that the southern states did not continue to be tyrants to African American peoples. This didn't work out too well if you study your U.S. history, but at least not early on. But there was an attempt, and there was an understanding that the federal government had an obligation to do those things. The second thing that the federal government has to do is protect the states from invasion or domestic violence. Now, when you say domestic violence, we're not talking about a wife and a husband getting into a tussle on cops. What we're talking about is rebellions and riots. Examples, there are a bunch from your book. Lyndon Baines Johnson sending in the Guard to deal with the Detroit riots in Detroit back in the 60s. Grover Cleveland dealing with strikers who were working for a railroad. They were getting a little violent and riotous, and so he dealt with that. Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy both had to send in the guard to make sure that desegregation happened smoothly. There were attempts, resistance from states to desegregation. There were threats made to students early on in desegregating schools, and for instance in Arkansas and Little Rock. So nowadays we also include natural disasters. So we expect the federal government to help us out with natural disasters. Anything from hurricanes that hit New Orleans to tornadoes that hit Oklahoma. We expect FEMA, the federal disaster agency, essentially emergency management agency, to come in and help us out. And the third thing is territorial integrity. The federal government has to respect the integrity of a state's borders. It cannot change the borders of a state without that state's permission. And that just really doesn't come up much. Now, admission of new states. There have been 37 states that have been admitted after the first 13, the original 13 colonies became states. This goes back to how federal governments have to respect territorial integrity. It also must be pointed out that acts of admission are like any other law, and the president can veto an act of admission. So how does this work? Well, Congress passes an enabling act which allows a territory to draft a constitution. Then the people in the territory vote on that constitution. If they vote yes for the constitution, then conditions can be required for admission, but the states, once they become states, can ignore any conditions that interfere with their reserved powers. This actually came up in Oklahoma. There was a condition set for admission of Oklahoma that the capital had to be in Guthrie, and it didn't take us very long to ignore that condition. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, hey, a state has reserved powers. It has a right to define where its own capital is, and the federal government doesn't get to tell them where their capital is going to be. So even though these conditions are set up, it doesn't mean a whole lot, really, generally. So you have the Enabling Act, these conditions might be set, and then the state is admitted into the Union. Another thing to remember about states is that each state is considered equal in the Union. That's probably best expressed by the equal representation in the Senate. Now, 5 states formed from existing states. They were Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, Maine, and West Virginia, and this all happened a long time ago. 2 states have special circumstances how they were formed. West Virginia broke away from Confederate Virginia during the Civil War, and Texas was admitted by a joint resolution rather than go through the whole act of admission process. And this had to do with the fact that it was its own republic, not a territory. Alaska and Hawaii had constitutions ready before they even had an Enabling Act passed by Congress. And the last thing to point out is Puerto Rico has been offered statehood and has rejected it. The National Governors Association is something in this section. Teddy Roosevelt started the governors' conferences. States share ideas through the National Governors Association. Governors work together to influence national policy, and they are quite influential. Now, states have an obligation. I'm not sure why this is brought up in this point in the book, but they have an obligation to conduct and pay for national elections. Of course, they have to approve any constitutional amendments that become official amendments. The courts as umpire. The division of powers requires someone to decide who has what power between the federal government and the state government. The courts play this role. This is expressed by the court case McCullough versus Maryland, where the Supremacy Clause was used by the courts to say that the national government wins when state laws conflict with constitutionally correct federal laws. So in areas where they both share power, if they both pass a law, federal law wins. This has been, in recent times, there have been laws that, court decisions that favor states like U.S. versus Lopez. which we've talked about in class.